I'm agnostic, essentially. When it comes to Judaism, it's more of a cultural heritage thing for me. These days, I'd say agnostic when it comes to religion. When I left home for college, there was like a year transition where I didn't quite yet want to admit that I was leaving Christianity, actually, because my father is Southern Baptist Christian. We were raised Southern Baptist. That really dominated. So I basically had the first year of college where I was like, I said I was questioning things. I still went to a Christian youth group. And basically by the summer, my first summer after, leaving home and going to college, I just admitted to myself I was agnostic. But I still identified as Jewish. I've always identified as Jewish in terms of an ethnicity, heritage, culture. As hard as that's been to kind of like fully engage with that, didn't have to be a choice, because you are, according to Jewish tradition, you are just Jewish. If your mother's Jewish, you just are Jewish. It doesn't even matter what you believe necessarily. But in terms of leaving Christianity, it was first year of college where I finally cut the cord, but there'd been a long period of sort of transitioning out, even if it was partially unconscious. But my father was a very staunch Christian. He's still a very staunch Christian. He's still a creationist. He still believes the Bible is literal. And that was the rule. My mother was, at the time, she was basically an agnostic Jew herself. Now she's sort of changed her stances on things. But at the time, she didn't really have a thing to impose on us, whereas my father had a belief system that we had to agree with. And then in fifth grade, like I said, we moved to an area where I would say the majority of people identified as Christian, even if they were dealing with a lot of their own contradictory beliefs. And so when I started questioning things in, say, school, I got a lot of pushback from the people who were very Christian there. In fact, at one point I was told that I was betraying my beliefs. And so it was a little bit of both, but it started primarily at home. I was raised as a creationist. I was raised to take the Bible literally. I was raised to believe that you were going to hell if you hadn't accepted Jesus into your life. I was able to do that basically up through middle school. And then in high school, I went to a governor's school for math and science half a day. And I was learning more about evolution and science in general. And I was just realizing that the rebuttals I'd been trained to give to, established science just didn't hold water. And there were already contradictions in the Bible, I would ask in Sunday school or something, or ask a pastor, but I always assumed there was an answer. And it was in high school where I started admitting myself, the answer might be that I've been raised to believe the wrong thing. People want something. Life is scary. Since I've stopped being Christian, I miss aspects of it. I miss having a God to pray to who would listen to me all the time and cared about me, and the certainty that even if I died, I would go to heaven, or that things were happening for a reason. I think life is very difficult, and I think the uncertainty drives people crazy. Sometimes it drives me crazy. My issue was that I just think too much. I'm too neurotic, and I question things too much. So I tried very hard to stay Christian, actually. That's why I say I had this year-long transition in college. I didn't want to stop being Christian. I don't want to sound condescending, but I learned too much. I learned too much about the overwhelming science, and you learn about other religions, and you learn to compare and contrast, and you look at the historical records, and for me it just wasn't really a choice anymore. I just couldn't believe it anymore. In my experience, still talking to my father, who's still very religious, you make a choice whether to accept information that contradicts your beliefs or not. And for me, I made the choice to accept information that contradicts that belief. My father has said he won't. He won't look at evidence, that would contradict it. He doesn't want to stop believing, and I don't know if I want him to stop believing, because it gives him his main source of comfort. So I guess that's the easy, not so easy answer, is that we're raised in different environments, and I would say some people need that security more than others of a worldview that guarantees certainty in an uncertain universe. I don't want to be too critical, but I also do. I think I would be much less neurotic if I had not grown up religious, especially the sect of Christianity that I grew up in. everything's a sin. You feel guilty for everything. There's constant pressure to convert people. Like I said, in previous answers, there's also pressure to deny things that other people just accept as reality. Interacting with people who aren't Christian, for example, when you're Christian, is very difficult, because my church taught that when you get to heaven, you would have to account for every person you could have saved but didn't. And you'd have to explain to God why you didn't make an effort. And just that pressure. I'd go to school with kids who weren't Christian, or they were Christian light or something, and I would worry, about when I got to heaven, there's just this giant backlist of people that I didn't, try to convert. And of course, obviously, I'm not going to break new ground by saying that, it's hard to explore sex if you're a very religious Christian, because sex is sinful until marriage. It's hard to engage with a lot of politics, and I was very politically interested growing up. And obviously, you have all these things that Christianity prohibits that you have to care about, even if you don't get why. Even as a kid, I never really understood why homosexuality was considered a sin. And I'd get all these different explanations, and I'd be like, okay, but why does God care? And so when you're talking, I had friends who were either bisexual or gay. I'd meet people, now my sister is queer. It's in the back of your mind, wondering and worrying, and I can't think of an area of life that it wouldn't affect almost. When I was a kid, I thought I might be a pastor, so obviously when I stopped being Christian, I no longer, considered that an option. I think more the sense with how you engage with a career. So now that I'm pursuing creative work, I don't have to worry as much about being appropriate, whatever that means. I don't have to worry about trying to make it align with a predetermined belief system. I can ask sort of the complicated, nebulous questions I want to ask without having to come to the conclusion of and that's why you should believe in Jesus, which when I was Christian, I would have to always, maybe this story isn't good, but I'm going to tell it. So I wrote a poem in middle school, and it had an adolescent nihilistic bent. It was 4 lines. Was truth is lie and lie is truth. War consumes and peace confuses. Life is strange and death is feared, and the world sings a song of question. That was my pithy adolescent poem about the state of the world. And my dad read it and he freaked out because it's not a very Christian poem. And so he told me I'd either have to delete it or I'd have to rewrite another stanza that would bring it back to somehow being hopeful and God or whatever. So I did that. I wrote 4 more lines that somehow was about finding hope or whatever. And it's just indicative. I mean, it sounds so silly now, but it's just indicative of there are these parameters set if you're a creative person and you have a rigid belief system that says, hey, you need to believe these things. You can't believe these things. You don't want to examine this issue too much because there's too many contradictions. And now it's a relief to just write, even though it's also scary because I don't know why we're here or where we go after we die. Obviously, growing up Christian, the expectation is that you have to marry a Christian person or convert whoever you marry, which was interesting because I'm the product of a mixed marriage. My father married a Jewish woman who was pretty ambivalent about Christianity most of the time we were growing up. It shifted around the time I entered high school, which was partially my fault. I don't know how much we want to get into that, but I essentially went to a Messianic temple to have my bar mitzvah. It was kind of the only temple that would accept me and that we could afford because bar mitzvahs can be super expensive. And Messianic Jews believe that Jesus qualifies as the Jewish Messiah. And they try to merge it. They don't celebrate Christian holidays, they celebrate Jewish holidays, but they find ways to work Jesus in. But before that, my father married a Jewish woman who was pretty ambivalent about Christianity, just kind of along for the ride because my dad was making us go to church. And now it's funny, now that I'm no longer Christian and I'm Jewish, there is pressure in the Jewish community, even if you're not religious, to marry Jewish. Like in a lot of small, I hesitate to say ethnic because people debate what being Jewish actually is, but kind of functioned as an ethnic cultural group, and there's the expectation that you will marry Jewish, you will have Jewish children, you will raise them Jewish, otherwise we will die out. And that I contend with a lot more now as an adult, even though I'm not religious, because I do worry about the future of the Jewish people, and I do wonder how much more I should be involved. It would be nice also to marry someone who understood the Jewish perspective, because I'm trying to be more Jewish as I grow older. But then it's ironic, because if I married a very Jewish person, I would come to it as a Jew with a Christian learning curve. So I do think about that a lot. I downloaded JSwipe for the first time recently. I deleted it pretty quickly. I felt overwhelmed, but I deleted all dating apps recently. But I would say that's what I struggle most with now. Growing up, it was finding someone who'd be compatible with the Christian lifestyle. Now it's trying to find someone who would be compatible not just with my Jewishness, but with my Jewishness, so to speak. I mean, a lot of people like to reference things Jesus said as just good things to do. Unfortunately, you also have to ignore a lot of other things Jesus said, like where he said, I'm the only way to heaven, so you can't take it wholesale. But tons of religions. I mean, that's why so many people have embraced Buddhism who aren't raised in that. Learning more about Judaism now as an adult, there are tons of principles that I didn't even know were an option that I think are great. You asked more about rules, but even like keeping the Sabbath is actually a really cool idea. I did a Jewish program here in Los Angeles that was run by Orthodox Jews, so they do everything by the letter. And I actually really liked the Sabbath. I really liked having this day-long period where you turned off everything and you just hung out with friends and family and ate good food and discussed things. I thought that was amazing. And I feel like that with a lot of sort of Jewish principles. There's one I reference a lot called Tikkun Olam, which is to heal the world. And it's just this idea that the world is inherently full of suffering and it's our duty to try to alleviate that suffering. So there are all kinds of great things you can pick out, just not from any one religion, unfortunately, at least not in my experience. In 5th grade, we moved to a county that was very anti-Semitic. So I was born in Maryland. I lived there until I was 4. Maryland, a lot of Jews in Maryland. We moved to Virginia. There are less Jews. We were living near like Fredericksburg area. And there you could feel like the bristling of it. So even at the church we went to, the pastors would make anti-Semitic comments. Or my mom would complain a lot going to like her Bible study and women there making anti-Semitic comments. In 5th grade, we moved to this other county that was even more rural. The demographics are interesting. So it's a historically black county, so there are actually more African Americans there than anybody. Then it's white people, mostly rural white people. And then I think there's like a small Latinx Hispanic community, and then no one else, essentially. You're like the only one of you if you're there. So there were like 3 Jews the total time I was there. There was like 1 person who had Middle Eastern heritage, 1 Asian person. And it was a bizarre place. I think when we talk about anti-Semitism, everyone references the Holocaust. And it seems mostly Jews are talking about modern anti-Semitism, but a lot of people don't even believe it exists. I've had people tell me that modern anti-Semitism isn't a thing. And so it's interesting. So we moved there. I've basically grown up Christian, but with, forays into Judaism. Like we'd go to my grandmother's house and do Passover with finding the matzah, maybe a little bit of Hanukkah. And like for me, it was kind of like a fun fact, and I was interested in it, but my dad didn't really want me delving too much into it. When I started asking my mom's side of the family questions and seemed interested, he'd be kind of freaked out by that. And so we moved to this county where it's a much bigger deal. And my parents actually told me not to tell anyone I was Jewish when we went to this county. And I was able to do that through like the first two or 3 years there. And then in 8th grade, I got outed by someone who was supposed to be my friend. And this is a school where like people drew swastikas on the bathroom walls. Jew was used as a derogatory term, like, oh, that's so Jewish. But you don't know how much of that is serious. Like in middle school, everyone's terrorizing everybody and everyone's insulting you for everything. So basically in 8th grade, this guy who was supposed to be my friend told a group of the guys who were very outspoken about not liking Jews that I was Jewish. And when people would ask me I was Jewish, I'd do a lawyer trick. I'd be like, oh, I'm Christian. And then he was like, oh no, his mom's Jewish. He's Jewish. I don't know why he did this. He was going through his own stuff or whatever. And then like ensued this like 3 to 4 year period of just kind of hellaciousness, not to be too dramatic, but basically the main guy who gave me a tough time at the end of middle school and up through like I think the first 2 or 3 years of high school was a self-proclaimed white supremacist, and we'd been friendly before that, and he found out I was Jewish, and it was just like a light switch flip, and a lot of like hate crime-esque stuff. I don't want to get like too much into it, or wallow too much in self-pity, but like it was scary. There were a lot of times I was actually afraid for my safety because I was physically being attacked or being threatened. And so this thing that had been kind of like a fun fact, for a lot of white people, you're like, I'm Irish, I'm French. And for me, I was like, I'm Irish, French, Austrian, German, Polish, Croatian, and Jewish. And it was like a fun fact where first went to school. Maybe there were anti-Semitic comments at church, but nobody was attacking you. And I went to this place where I was fine. I mean, it wasn't fine. I was bullied for like other reasons because it's middle school, and it was like a tough school system. But like then it was suddenly this big thing. And the weird thing about that is it lasted up through, like I said, like I think it was sophomore, junior year. Particularly by this one guy. There are other people who he kind of like roped into it. It was like this small little community of people who just didn't like Jews, even though they'd never really met Jews, didn't know anything about Judaism. It's just kind of a small town prejudice thing. And there was one summer I came back. I've been going, I started out as a really little kid with a high voice. And starting in 8th grade, I started getting a steady growth spurt of like at least an inch a year. And so I started as one of the short kids, and by the end of high school, I was one of the tall kids. And there's this one summer I came back, and so this guy who had been terrorizing me in various ways. We're in like gym class, first day of school. I feel someone push me from behind. I turn around, and he was looking up at me. And I could just kind of like see it on his face, the realization of like, oh, I've peaked. I'm not the big kid anymore. Like, I was taller than him, and it just stopped. And he wanted to pretend like it never happened. That was the weird thing. Like after that, he was like trying to be nice to me, and he would have people come up to me and they would say things like, oh, so-and-so wants to know why I act so weird around him. Like, the past like 3 or 4 years of being like physically, emotionally, verbally attacked, like just hadn't happened. And he's just suddenly fine with the fact that I'm Jewish now, before when it was such a, a deal breaker. So it's weird. That's the weird thing about being Jewish in general. I think it was exacerbated living in this weird county in the South. It can mean everything, or to people it can be a fun fact. That's the really weird thing about being Jewish. And for me, kind of contending with it growing up and trying to engage with it more, I have a lot of imposter syndrome where I don't know how much of it to claim. I even feel weird kind of talking about anti-Semitic incidents because it sounds dramatic, and a lot of people don't really think that kind of stuff happens anymore. And I don't want, my Jewish identity to be all anti-Semitism, but it did kick into gear me becoming more interested in it. So the reason I decided to get a bar mitzvah was because I started being bullied around that time. And I had this period where I was obsessed with Holocaust movies, as great as that was for my mental health. And I was just watching every Holocaust movie there was and getting really depressed and feeling like kind of defiant. And it's 8th grade, like you're already an angry middle schooler. I started working out. I was like, no. And so I got a bar mitzvah, but it had to be at this like basically kind of a Christian Jewish temple. And I didn't tell anybody I had a bar mitzvah at my school. I kept it secret. I was really nervous going to and from temple that somebody would see me. It was in Richmond. My mom had a Star of David like earrings or a necklace, and I asked her not to wear them. I was scared that more people would find out. So it was just a bizarre kind of surreal experience where part of the time it was fine, part of the time it was overwhelmingly traumatic, and then it went back to being kind of fine again. Which I think is the experience for a lot of Jews out in the world. Like especially since Jews have done so much to assimilate since the Holocaust, where it's, I don't want to say a coin flip, maybe that's like too derivative, but it feels like that. Like it could be fine, or it could mean somebody trying to strangle you, or shooting up your temple, or, insert hate crime-esque thing. The funny thing is I was interested in Judaism since I was a little kid. And I don't know where that came from. I remember I was having a crisis at my church one day. I was always crying over something because I was a very guilt-ridden kid, and I felt guilty because I'd been wondering whether other religions could be right. And I was talking to some kind of counselor about this, and he was like, well, what other religions would you even consider? I was like, well, Judaism. And I would ask my aunts questions, my mom's side of the family. And then, like I said before, in middle school, it started almost as this act of defiance. And, it dovetailed nicely with my own kind of adolescence and trying to become more of my own individual in a situation where it was pretty hard to do that, especially if I was trying to leave the faith of Christianity that I'd been brought up with. And so basically when I got to college and I decided I wasn't Christian anymore, I'm still searching. And, we're all searching for something. And the nice thing about being Jewish is you don't have to be religious to be Jewish. I mean, some Jews would disagree, but the grand majority of Jews, from what I've read and heard in America, are basically like agnostic or just spiritual. And I love that aspect. I wanted something, I'd always been trying to find something in my heritage to connect to, and I was looking for sort of a spiritual system and a culture. And Jews are actually very, well, I'm lucky that it's my mother, because that, it's harder for people who it's only their father who are Jewish in some situations. The Jews are very welcoming of you, even if you didn't grow up Jewish. In fact, they want you to come back into the fold. So I went on Birthright. I did this other Jewish program here in LA. There's all kinds of groups. And so it was really nice to have a community that was welcoming, but didn't, when I'm interacting more with Orthodox Jews, they do want you to convert, so to speak. But for most Jews, they're not telling you how to live your life, but they're still welcoming you. They're still giving you a community. They're still giving you at least, a spiritual, moral framework to kind of examine the universe with. And that's what I'm really craving now and have been craving for a while. I've been slacking off in various ways of fully engaging, and I go in and out of it. But I think that's really the appeal of Judaism for me, is it allows me to still be my own person while also connecting to this larger community, for lack of a better word. I do wish people would let things be complicated, and I include Judaism in that. And I think we should let identities be complicated. It's an interesting time now where it seems like we're obviously living in a very polarized time that's at once embracing, diversity and intersexuality and all these great things, and then there's also this great backlash against it. But then there's also this tension of, at least on the more liberal side, where people are maybe a little too eager to claim things that might seem like appropriation, or they're overemphasizing something. And I think for Judaism, when I try to explain what Judaism is, people are always like, well, what is it? Is it a religion? Is it an identity? It's not an ethnicity, because, people will quibble that a lot. I'm like, we don't necessarily have to know what it is. It's for the people, who have it to figure out. Which then gets difficult because, like I said, some Jews don't believe that you're Jewish if, your father is Jewish, but your mother isn't Jewish, and I'm not a fan of that. But I think we should and I'm biased because I'm obviously, Jewish, and it's complicated, and I don't really know what it means for me yet. But I think we should do that not just with Judaism, but with a lot of identities. Let people be complicated. There's too many boxes we could all check for those boxes to fully describe us.